Can you tell me how much the model cost to make?
The total cost, I would estimate very closely to 1,300 marks. That, to give you a feel, would buy you a little car like my Opel was. A good sports car comparable to a Porsche would at that time cost in the neighborhood of 5,000–6,000 mark.
How did you manage to afford the money?
I saved a little bit, as a matter of fact, and sold even some of my optical equipment, like a Leica and like other optical equipments which my grandmother had given me. And the rest I asked my dad to help, and also I had a little bit money saved from my allowances.
What happened when you first joined Heinkel?
When I first joined Heinkel, I wanted to build combustors, because the combustor was the point which gave us the greatest problem. But Heinkel was so very impatient and wanted to fly. I felt I had that strange sense of insecurity, and I couldn't expect any help from the rest of the people at Heinkel because we didn't know each other. I was new and very young. And when I walked on the Baltic Sea beaches during the nights to think about what to do, I came to the idea, why not build a demonstrator strictly with hydrogen, because I felt my system of a radial outflow compressor with a radial inflow turbine was completely secure and absolutely sure to work. And now when I would have an equally sure combustor with hydrogen, which I think I could build, then I thought I have an engine which demonstrates the principle so beautiful and so impressive that no one would even think to fire me anymore, and I would get the support for getting more.
Can you remember when the hydrogen demonstrator ran?
When it ran was about 1937. And our designer was a man Gunderman, who liked always jokes and limericks and this kind of thing. And he said, hey, we built it in 9 months, meaning that it takes a baby 9 months, and it took us with a gas turbine 9 months. Also, I remember when we ran the engine, it was extremely impressive when the puddles of water, the water was blown out and gave a fantastic picture. Now, sometime when Heinkel brought people in and we had night frost, then the mechanic went quickly around and with his feet destroyed the ice so that the ice blocks and the water flew. Now these are very strange ways to say when was that. Now the fact is exactly, I cannot give it to you. I wasn't interested in the history or so. I didn't see myself at that time as a museum piece or any such thing. I was just thinking what we do now and next. And I felt that was the obligation of Heinkel's people to do that. Now we all remembered that it was around that time, but Heinkel in his memoirs wrote 17th of September 36. And I did a terrible thing. I overlooked that in when he gave me the proofreads, or rather an initial to read. And so I was very happy when I saw that, and don't know how it came. Probably because we had another engine at that time which fits about that date.
Fine, thanks very much indeed. The thing I was going to mention here, of course, was that it's just about the same time as Whittle's first engine ran, although you weren't aware of his work.
Now, I always object to comparison because Whittle's engine was, in a sense, much further advanced because he did not do it out of psychological reasons and utilizing gaseous hydrogen. He already had lost a lot of time with the first fuel combustors. Whittle's work he started to design it in mid-35.
Well, you went from the hydrogen engine to what?
To the gasoline engine, which really would be an airplane engine, driving an airplane.
Presumably your stock, your esteem in the company went up.
Oh yes, it was very nice. I became division chief. I was reporting directly to Heinkel, and I became very much befriended with the Günthers, or with Siegfried Günther, because Walter had an accident, died. It was a very, very nice time, very hard work, because Heinkel was very impatient. He wanted to fly very soon. So that was a wonderful time.
What sort of a day did you have then? I mean, you said you worked very hard.
Well, it was not from any time, it was till night till, and at home you still worked, and so you really wanted to succeed.
The Heinkel 178, who designed that plane?
The Günthers, Siegfried Günther made the, I think Walter Günther was the man who made the aerodynamic design, and it was then that he had that deadly accident and his brother continued. Now the engine, the flight engine, I would call it the first engine, not really the final engine. The first engine which was flying was the 3B, and it was an engine which had about the same rotor as we had tested, namely a radial outflow compressor and a radial inflow turbine. And the combustor was, upon suggestion of Max Hahn, he gave me a very nice suggestion to put it in front. So we had a reversed annular combustion chamber, and that made it possible that rotor of the compressor and rotor of the turbine were extremely close together.
Could you test the parts individually?
No, we had no test stands, but it was very fortunate when you have a radial inflow turbine with the same diameter about as the compressor, they are automatically matched. So it was a great advantage, and the temperature, the operational temperature, was determined by the cascades.
Were materials a problem to you?
For mass production, yes, but for the first engines, we used very good alloyed austenitic steels. Later on, we had to think, for the real production engines, we had to think how to cool the turbines with air, and the actual flow turbine was by far easier to cool than the radial flow turbine. But in the very beginning, we had enough headaches with the problems of performance and safety and endurance that these problems came a little bit later.
What were the characteristics of the Heinkel 178? It was never designed to be anything but a prototype, right?
Yes, it was designed to produce an aircraft system which showed the principle. Now, Heinkel probably was very much forced, like I was forced, to use psychology to have something first to show and then get ultimately the facilities for it. You know, his goal was to buy a airplane factory, and it was almost at that time an unbelievable, crazy hope to do that, but he did it.
Sorry, in what sense did he do it?
Oh, you see, after we had the very first flight, he invited the Air Ministry to come, and that was just when the war sort of broke out. The troops went over to Poland and England and France. As I recall, after the first flight, we learned through the loudspeaker that we were actually in war with England and France because they stood to the guarantee for Poland. And then Heinkel invited the higher level Air Ministry people. They were not really overly enthused about the flight performance demonstrated by the Heinkel 178. And Heinkel used, however, that opportunity to show to the Air Ministry his first prototype fighter design or concept, which was a two-engine outboard-mounted type of a fighter. And he got the contract, and he made with UDET the strange arrangement I never could understand, that when he can hold the date that it flies in about April of 1942, then he would get the money and could buy the factory. Early in the morning, a small group from Heinkel's people, very selected, could witness when warsats took the machine off into the air. And I remember distinctly our fears and our wishes. And it was, I don't know exactly, 4 o'clock or something in the morning, and a light fog, very little, just I would call it light dust, when he started, and then he disappeared. And after a while he came back, and we thought, oh, he's landing. He didn't. He made another round, and we said, oh my God, he must like it. But we didn't have the airplane very filled up with gasoline, so we hoped he would come back, and pretty soon he actually came back, slipped, made a slight slip, and landed. It looked like very skilled and absolutely simple, not anything difficult. And he landed and stopped the airplane just where Heinkel stood, and the whole group of Heinkel. So that was very, very good and well done. But we found out later on that it wasn't that he enjoyed the flying, but he couldn't see the glare of the dust on the ground when he came from the higher level. He couldn't see early enough the field, and so he couldn't land, and made a shorter curve and then landed. So that was but it was still a wonderful story, and he said everything functioned beautiful, and and the engine worked well, and he was really himself, very enthused. We had a nice festival.
And then Heinkel went off to phone Udet.
He called Udet. I didn't know. He didn't tell me I will now call Udet. I learned later on he called Udet, and he said, "Hey, congratulations, but let me sleep. That's an ungodly time." And
So the advent of the jet age.
yeah, that was an ungodly time. And he probably was called by 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning.
Up to that time, you had presumably had really all the resources you needed. You weren't in the case of Frank Whittle, who was trying to grasp every penny he could get.
No, we didn't have money problems, although we were, by nature, this project was extremely inexpensive by its very nature. We didn't need much tool machines because we used this few lasers, the bigger ones, which we didn't have. We went to the shipyard, which was adjacent, and paid a little bit for that, was not expensive. So actually, the whole development was very inexpensive, but when we would have asked for more money, we would have gotten it. So money was not a problem, designers was a problem. We didn't have engineers. We had one good designer, Mr. Gunderman, who was really very nice to work with, and a few draftsmen, and no machines and no test stands. We could not make any compressor or turbine testing.
What was the attitude of the Air Ministry towards Heinkel and the engine?
Well, first they didn't know much about it, if any. And once they learned in about early summer 1938, that was more than a year before we flew, the Air Ministry was very positive to the idea of jet propulsion. And Hans Maug said, very thankful to Heinkel and to me, that he didn't even know anything about the concept of jet propulsion. But in a very short time, he studied it himself and came to the conclusion that it's a key to future fighter aircraft. So he was absolutely more than positive. He was enthusiastic for jet propulsion for airplanes.
But over him?
Over him was Eisenlohr, and I do not know when he started to explain it to Eisenlohr. Maug was a man who felt so strong for himself that he didn't care much, I believe, what his boss said. In addition, he was a very good friend of Udet, because both were pilots. Maug was a pilot too some time ago. And so I think Hans Maug was not so much in any problem or had a problem with the higher echelons of the Air Ministry, but he had the following problem. He couldn't persuade Heinkel to give the production up and send me and the group of engineers to Daimler-Benz what he wanted. And Heinkel just simply said no to it. And Helmut Schelp, who was much more trained in the area of jet propulsion, he did not need to be persuaded. He was already very much convinced, and he joined Maug as his right-hand man, and later on became his successor. Now, Helmut Schelp felt, yes, we, like Maug, we have to get the big industry into it, but we don't have to push Heinkel out. In contrast, he thought that Heinkel's work made it easier for him to have a backing against his higher echelons, because there was already an airplane flying now, pretty soon, I mean. And he wanted that Heinkel produces as much as possible evidence and also to persuade the industry.
The circumstances of the first flight, were you apprehensive or were you certain?
Oh no, I was very certain that it would work. But of course you always feel there's a danger, and we had made not too many pre-tests. We ran the engine before it flew perhaps several hours at the very most. We had one rotor which we ran 10 hours, but we didn't fly with that because we investigated what happened. Nothing exploded, nothing went wrong after the 10 hours. But we had really, we thought each time it's good when it's over. You know, that kind of bearing go, nothing will explode. We knew in the engine, even when you have a failure, you can still land. That we were absolutely sure. But we were afraid that something could happen to the bearings or to the blades.
Can you tell me now about the German Air Ministry demonstration in November?
Heinkel invited the Air Ministry to come, and I do believe that the highest who came was Udet, and I know a man with the name Reidenbach, which was very high up, but I don't know exactly how high he was. And several others came, and Heinkel was first very disappointed. The people did not show too much interest, and Udet made many comments that Warsitz should come and land. One cannot fly so long with such an airplane. And Heinkel was very unhappy. And then came that big breakfast they had, and somehow Heinkel used that possibility to offer a new design of a two-engine fighter aircraft. And actually, he got the contract about 2 months later. It was accepted by the Air Ministry, and Udet and Heinkel made an extra kind of deal. I don't know why and what the meaning was, but it was this: when Heinkel can show the 280, which was that new airplane, fighter airplane, could fly by about April 1941. Then he would be able, or would get the permission to buy the Hirt Corporation.
Which would give him all the skilled engineers that he needed.
Oh yes, Hirt had the most fantastic group of engineers, testants, component testants, and that together with our engineers would have been a fantastic team.
Tell me, what did you go on to do after the first flight of the prototype? Did you go on to work on other engines?
Oh yes, there was that point in 14 months we had to fly with a 280. Heinkel had two projects. He had the project of Herbert Wagner, which was a small diameter axial flow gas turbine, and that would have been a beautiful propulsion system for the 280. However, the group of Herbert Wagner, which now worked for Heinkel, was very much in doubt whether they could make it in that short time. And so Heinkel pressed me very hard. What can we do? We have to have this flying in order to buy the Hirt Corporation, and all our problems are over. And I had now a tremendous risky thing, namely, I had to use the rotor type of our first flying aircraft. But we had to make the diameter very small, and I choose for that an actual kind of diffuser, which was unbelievably risky. I asked the DVL, Deutsche Versuchsanstalt for Luftfahrt, and they said that won't work. An axial flow compressor is not suited for an axial flow diffuser is not suited for a radial flow compressor. So I get very discouraging views. Now, we built nevertheless one, and a through-flow annular combustor, which was the most compressed type of combustion facility. Now, with that, we tried to make it, and I had so little time, and imagine in 14 months we had really gotten the performance almost, but ready to test on Heinkel's small airfield, and it worked better than we thought. So actually it was a gamble, and we were lucky. It was not a real honest development.
You've, just an aside, but when we last saw you in Florida, not here, you said that you have been generally lucky, haven't you? You were telling me that you believed that at certain times you had a guardian angel.
Yes, particularly in my decisions to whom to go and what to do and how to do it. There was definitely an unbelievable amount or accumulation of good luck. And after I heard our great Newman, Gerhard Newman, who has the philosophy, luck is everything, so I had quite a bit of it.
Just going back for a moment to the demonstration in November 1939, would you regard that as a turning point in the German Air Ministry's attitude towards jet engines?
Yes. Udet came to Heinkel and almost embraced him and said, it is unbelievable. He was so enthusiastic after he saw the 280 flying. It was really a tremendous impression. It was for them now a well understood vision of the future.
You said 280. Did you mean the 178?
No, not the 178.
It's the demonstration of the 280?
Yes.
When was that, Hans?
On that day where Heinkel got the factory, the permission to buy the factory, namely in 41.
I am talking about November 1939, though, the demonstration.
Oh, that was not the turning point.
Not the turning point?
No.
What was, do you think?
It was, no one dared to touch Heinkel, so it was a step. But the real turning point was the flying of the 280, where he got now the permission, which is unbelievable, unheard, in the middle of the war, that Heinkel became what he always dreamed, a turbine manufacturer, because he had everything now, manufacturing facilities, engineers. After the flight with the 178, he only had gained a position that they could not brutally squash him out. They were not very enthusiastic. Udet was not overly enthusiastic. He was more concerned about the life of Warsitz, and that looked a little bit, particularly when I tell you the sad part of it, that they couldn't get the landing gear in, and so they flew with the landing gear out. And that looked anyway not extremely elegant. When Warsitz came and went down to the spectators, they said, "Oh my God, this doesn't look good to us." And no, the flight of the 178 only opened the door for him to get the contract for the 280. And that was really the turning point.
Excellent. I mean, that's clearer than I've ever heard it before. Thanks very much. But it was the case, was it not? And perhaps you'd give this back to me. It was the case, was it not, that the lower echelons of the Air Ministry were really quite enthusiastic?
Well, they were very happy because they knew now that their plan with the engine industry, no matter what, could not endanger them anymore, because after all, Heinkel flew. and they pressed and could really allocate large resources to Junkers and BMW. In that sense, yes, it was an additional turning point. It gave all the backing for the lower echelons of the Air Ministry that they made these contacts with BMW and with Junkers.
The German Messerschmitt Me-262. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, it was a quantum leap in fighter technology. For the Allies, the appearance of the new swept-wing fighter caused a great deal of anxiety and consternation. Nothing they had could come close to its awesome performance.
The top Allied fighter at the end of the war was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. The Messerschmitt 262, which we captured and tested at Farnborough, had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. An advantage of almost 125 miles an hour, which means an aircraft with this performance, which is a quantum jump, can dictate terms of combat. It can initiate or finish combat as it wishes. It was a very formidable weapon indeed.
Considered by many to be the world's first jet fighter, it was in fact a distant second. Indeed, the first air-to-air kill credited to a jet fighter goes to the Gloucester Meteors of 616 Squadron RAF. On August 4, 1944, Flying Officer Dixie Dean, using the wingtip of his Meteor, toppled a V-1 flying bomb, sending it crashing into the ground. While the V-1 was a pilotless aircraft, it would still go down in history as the first jet versus jet encounter. It was a telling indictment. After a 21-month lead in jet fighter development, the Germans found themselves with just one design in production, the Me-262. By June 1944, only a handful were in service. But there was another jet fighter, one designed and built before the Me-262, the Heinkel He-280. Designed by Ernst Heinkel, it was capable of over 500 miles per hour. At this late stage of the war, the He-280 was nowhere to be seen. First flown in September of 1940, it was 2 years ahead of Willy Messerschmitt's Me-262. What happened? Was it simply indifference on the Luftwaffe's part, or was the promise of the He-280 sabotaged by political interference, incompetence, or bitter personal rivalries? To find the answers, we must first look at the state of military aircraft design and production, beginning in the 1930s. Since the end of the First World War, aircraft engine horsepower steadily increased. At the beginning of the 1930s, new engine designs and the promise of the supercharger led to more and more horsepower. The new all-metal monocoque airplane revolutionized aircraft design. The possibilities seemed limitless. Speed, altitude, and range records were smashed. Military commanders saw great promise in these new designs, and as Europe crept toward war, orders for new bombers and fighters began to rise. With little time or money left for the development of any new or questionable propulsion systems, work focused on the evolution of the piston engine. Many engine builders called the idea of a jet engine the thing, technically unfathomable and little more than a pipe dream. But there were those whose pipe dreams would become reality. In 1930, Flying Officer Frank Whittle, RAF, applied for a patent for his jet engine. This was followed by Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain and his secret jet engine patent in 1935. Robert Pohl, a colleague of Ohain at the University of Göttingen, was instrumental in bringing Ohain's invention to the attention of leading German aircraft manufacturer Ernst Heinkel.
This man, Pohl was the name, he wrote to Heinkel, whom he knew. And he said, I have a man here who is into something which I think has a tremendous future to it. He is into jet propulsion. It's a continuous combustion engine. It draws air in the intake, compresses it, and then the combustion cans are sprayed with gasoline, and it turns the turbine wheel to keep the thing running, and the exhaust comes out the half end of it. As long as you give it fuel, it'll run forever. And he says, I have a man here who wrote a thesis about this sort of application for a jet engine. It pleased me very much if you would meet him and see him and talk to him about his ideas and his applications for future aircraft.
With Heinkel's backing, the German inventor created a line of experimental centrifugal flow jet engines, similar to Whittle's, each with ever more thrust. The entire program was conducted as a private venture and in the utmost secrecy. The German Air Ministry was kept in the dark. On the other hand, Heinkel was also unaware that BMW was working on their own jet engine. BMW's design was an axial flow unit. More complicated than the centrifugal design, it offered more power and greater efficiencies. It was also being developed with the full knowledge of the German Air Ministry. In time, axial flow designs would power Germany's fledgling jet force.
Early in the days immediately before the war, the Germans had become aware of the practicality of a jet-propelled engine as being pioneered by Frank Whittle. And at first, they followed the same concept as Whittle of centrifugal flow, which is the simplest form of jet engine, really, and also probably the most reliable at that stage, certainly, in their pioneering efforts. But eventually they turned quite rapidly after their first, if you like, experiments onto the axial flow type, which really offers many advantages. And they concentrated thereafter totally on axial flow engines. And within the limitations of the strategic materials they had, they were very successful in this. The only problem was that the axial flow engine is complex and therefore difficult to produce, time-consuming to produce. And also, unless you have the right strategic materials to contain the heat stresses, it can have a rather short productive life.
Work on a suitable test airframe for Heinkel's revolutionary new power plant was conducted at the same time. By August 1939, both engine and airframe were ready. Heinkel's HE-178 was no masterpiece. The short fuselage and stubby elliptical wooden wings did not exude a sense of speed. On August 27th, test pilot Erich Varsitz settled himself into the cramped cockpit of the tiny aircraft. Watched by Ernst Heinkel and a small group of mechanics, the HE-178 began to roll. The takeoff run was short. Climbing to 500 meters, Varsitz circled the airfield once and came in for a perfect landing. Total flight time, 7 minutes. History had been made. Wasting no time, Heinkel telephoned Ernst Udet, the chief of aircraft procurement and supply at the RLM, the Reich's Air Ministry. The response Heinkel received was far from enthusiastic. The world's first jet would have to wait. On September 1st, Germany plunges Europe into war. Long before 1939, the name Heinkel had become a household name in Germany. Indeed, Ernst Heinkel's Flugzeugwerk had gained a worldwide reputation despite considerable restrictions placed on German aviation by the Versailles Treaty of 1919. During the 1920s and 30s, Heinkel produced a number of new military types for countries like Sweden and Japan. With the rise of Hitler in 1933 and the expansion of the new Luftwaffe, the opportunities for Heinkel seemed endless. Orders for fighters and bombers began to pour in. While many of Heinkel's designs, like the HE-111 bomber, were very good, they lacked what he desired the most: speed. Heinkel was passionate about high-speed flight.
Well, Heinkel, he loved aircraft that flew fast. He wasn't all that into aircraft that were fighters, propeller-driven fighters and escorts and that sort of stuff, like the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was a man consumed by speed. The faster an aircraft knew, man, I'm for that.
Even before the first flight of the HE-178, he created the HE-176, the world's first rocket plane, in 1939. Unfortunately for Heinkel, official reaction was muted, and with the onset of war, all work on the project ceased.
Udet, Goering, and all those other people in the early Reichsluftfahrtministerium were propeller people. They believed airplanes that were driven by propellers and alternate engine systems. They said, no, an airplane flies best with propellers. And so Heinkel was looked upon as some kind of a crackpot. And the research he was doing on jet engines, they felt was just silly and waste of money. And so he never got any real support from the Nazi government.
Shortly after Hitler came to power, a new requirement for an ultra-modern single-seat monoplane fighter was issued. Heinkel's response was the HE-112, powered by a 695-horsepower Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Its direct competition was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 V1, also powered by the same Kestrel engine. The results were very close. While the Bf 109 was slightly faster, the HE-112 had a tighter turning circle and superior field performance. Amid general surprise and many raised eyebrows, Messerschmitt was awarded the new contract.
The Heinkel 112 was the better airplane as a combat airplane, and Rechlin test pilots endorsed that view entirely. So there was no doubt that from the pilot's point of view, Heinkel's 112 was number one.
For Heinkel, it was a bitter disappointment. It also marked the beginning of a new and rocky relationship between the aircraft manufacturer and the German Air Ministry. Undeterred, Heinkel continued with his quest for speed. Despite the lack of enthusiasm from Ernst Udet and later Erhard Milch, the State Secretary, Reich Air Ministry, Heinkel pressed on with his privately funded HE-280 twin-jet fighter. At the same time, the Messerschmitt Design Bureau completed a new twin-jet design study for the German Air Ministry. Submitted on June 7, 1939, the new proposal was accepted. On March 1, 1940, a contract for 3 airframes was awarded with the official designation ME-262. Simultaneously, and in the face of official apathy, Heinkel was rewarded with a similar contract. Even before the official contract had been signed, Heinkel had in fact cut metal on the first HE-280 prototype. The HE-280 was a quantum leap in aircraft design. Aside from the jet propulsion, the HE-280 was equipped with the world's first ejection seat and a tricycle landing gear. Prior to its first flight, a series of aerodynamic tests were conducted. Fitted with dummy engine nacelles, the prototype was towed into the air by an HE-111 and subjected to a number of gliding test runs. By March 30, 1941, the HE-280 V1 was ready for its first flight. With just enough fuel for takeoff, the HE-280 lifted into the air. After a single low-altitude, low-speed circuit, the HE-280 made a safe landing. It was the world's first jet fighter, but the world didn't take notice.
The Heinkel 280 was a state-of-the-art machine which no one really appreciated.
Just as the Germans were developing their jet technology, the Allies had their own secret jet programs as well. In England, Frank Whittle, like Ernst Heinkel, was battling against the same government indifference. The new jets were not a high priority. Frank's persistence, however, finally paid off. On February 3, 1940, the British Air Ministry issued Britain's first jet aircraft contract. Gloucester's aircraft was selected to meet specification E-2839. Design of this new aircraft was a collaboration between Frank Whittle and Gloucester Aircraft. The new E-2839 was a low-winged monoplane with the engine mounted behind the cockpit and equipped with a tricycle undercarriage, just like the HE-280. Air for the engine was drawn in from the nose and passed through ducts on each side of the cockpit. Like the Heinkel He-178, the Gloster E-2839 was one of the world's first technology demonstrator aircraft. Its sole purpose was to flight test Whittle's W-1 centrifugal jet engine, which developed a modest 860 pounds of thrust. A remarkable aircraft by any standard, 2 examples were built. On May 15, 1941, the first E-2839 took off from Cranwell Airfield at 7:45 p.m. The flight lasted just 17 minutes. The promise of Whittle's engine pushed the Air Ministry towards an operational jet fighter. Even before the first E-2839 took shape, specification F-940 for a new jet fighter was finalized in December 1940. Because the new jet engine didn't have the required thrust, the new fighter would have to be a twin-engine design. The F-940 was not a radical or advanced aerodynamic design. Following accepted aircraft practices, it was fairly conventional. On February 7, 1941, Glosters received an order for 12 Gloster Whittle airplanes to the F-940 specification. These would become the first Gloster Meteors. Back in Germany, parallel work on the Me-262 was not proceeding smoothly. When the contract for the prototype had been issued, it was obvious to Messerschmitt that BMW had been unduly optimistic. The new BMW 003 axial flow engine was still unreliable, without sufficient power. It also had a substantially larger diameter. In order to accommodate the new, larger engine, Messerschmitt had to completely redesign his original airframe. The new aircraft would be larger, with the engines housed in underwing nacelles, just like the HE-280. While BMW struggled with their jet engine, the Junkers Aircraft Company was working on their own turbojet, the Jumo 004. This would provide a backup in case the BMW 003 failed. On November 1940, the Jumo 004 was bench tested for the first time. Major problems were revealed, and just as the HE-280 V1 made its first flight, Messerschmitt's first Me-262 V1 was fitted with a nose-mounted Junkers Jumo piston engine. It was not the start Willy Messerschmitt was hoping for. On April 5, 1941, the HE-280 was officially unveiled. To impress his guests, Heinkel arranged for a demonstration between a Focke-Wulf FW-190A and the HE-280. During the mock combat, the HE-280 completed 4 tight circles before the FW-190 completed 3. Finally, Ernst Udet showed some enthusiasm. Top speed was 485 miles per hour, 77 more than the FW-190. Impressed, the German Air Ministry sanctioned the manufacture of 13 HE-280A pre-production aircraft. Unfortunately for Heinkel, mass production of the HE-280 was still out of reach. Heinkel now found himself up against personal rivalries, duplication, and incompetent leadership. To understand this state of affairs, we have to return to the beginning of the new Luftwaffe. After Hitler took power, he appointed Hermann Göring as leader of the new Luftwaffe. A World War I ace and squadron commander, Göring soon gave a number of his ex-squadron mates titles in the newly formed Luftwaffe. Ernst Udet was one of the first. Many had no experience in aircraft production, or had any business background. By 1941, German aircraft manufacturing was in a crisis. Under the command of Ernst Udet, aircraft production had stalled. For the first year and a half of war, Germany was only producing 800 aircraft a month. It wasn't until after the Battle of Britain and the setbacks in Russia did the German High Command take action. Unfortunately for Udet, he was unable to effect any real change. In November 1941, he committed suicide. Udet's successor was Erhard Milch. Milch was an able, ruthless administrator, but he lacked the military expertise necessary for the job. Although he had good understanding of aircraft production, he was unimaginative and a conservative when it came to research and development. July 18, 1942. The first Me-262 is ready for its first flight. Unlike the HE-280, the Me-262 is a tail dragger. Because of the nose's high angle, most of the jet's thrust is wasted. After a problematic takeoff run, it takes to the air for a short 17-minute flight.
When the Messerschmitt 262 was first tested, it was a tail dragger. It had a tail wheel. And the only way you could get the thing up and level was for the pilot to put on the brakes, and so the aircraft would come up level, and then they could take off with it.
Across the Atlantic, America finally enters the jet age with the first flight of the Bell P-59A. The date is October 1st, 1942. By the summer of 1942, the HE-280 was still very much in the picture. In June, the HE-280 V2 prototype was re-engined with two Jumo 004A engines, each rated at 1,852 pounds of thrust. Now, for the first time, both the HE-280 and the Me-262 are equipped with the same type of engine. Flight trials proved promising, with a top speed of 491 miles an hour being reached. A true comparison of the two fighters could now be made. Flight testing of the fourth Me-262 prototype showed that with the same power plants, it enjoyed a marked performance advantage over the HE-280. Compared to the straight-wing HE-280, the Me-262 looked faster. Its shark-like appearance and swept-back wings gave it a menacing presence. Even with this apparent advantage, the Me-262 still had a long way to go. For Heinkel and Messerschmitt, the road ahead was not a simple one. Both had suffered serious setbacks, their reputations now in question. In Messerschmitt's case, his new Me-210 twin-engine fighter was a complete failure. For Heinkel, the intractable problems associated with the disastrous HE-177 heavy bomber was a major distraction. By the summer of 1942, Germany was still victorious. After some unexpected setbacks in Russia, they were once again on the offensive. In North Africa, the first Battle of El Alamein began with Erwin Rommel leading the way. From a military perspective, Germany was at the height of its power, but it was now fighting on three fronts. Losses would be heavy. In September, the Battle of Stalingrad began with much promise. It was a bloody battle of attrition, and one in which Germans were losing. On November 1st, Allied troops break out of El Alamein. 7 days later, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops invade North Africa, with American and British troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's fabled Africa Corps is now being squeezed on two sides. November 19th. Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. Its aim, surround the city of Stalingrad and annihilate all German forces. The Soviet offensive is a spectacular success, and by the end of January 1943, the battle is all but over. The German Sixth Army surrenders. It was the first Nazi acknowledgement of failure. In May, the battle for Tunisia is over. German and Italian forces surrender, with 250,000 troops taken prisoner. These military losses represented a key turning point. Germany was now on the defensive. For the Luftwaffe, January 1st, 1943 represented a time of crisis. Its operational strength had sunk to some 4,000 aircraft. It had also failed to introduce new, more modern types, aircraft like the HE-280 and the Me-262. In fact, the Luftwaffe was drawing on its last accumulated reserves. Contingency plans were non-existent. Any new military setback would be catastrophic. The German High Command had resolutely declined the possibility of waging a defensive war. From Hitler on down, the mantra had always been attack. The losses in Stalingrad and North Africa put a severe strain on Luftwaffe resources. For the first time, serious cracks began to show. But it wasn't just the losses in North Africa and Stalingrad that hobbled the once mighty Luftwaffe. the pre-war belief that Germany's military conquests would be short led to short-term planning. New modern aircraft wouldn't be needed. It was a strategic miscalculation, and one that had a direct effect on the development of Heinkel's HE-280 and Messerschmitt's Me-262.
Heinkel was up against the German Air Ministry, even though he had Ernst Udet as his very good friend and confidant. The German Air Ministry, they wanted a flying machine propeller driven like the Focke-Wulf 190, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109, that were designed for ground support, like in Poland and elsewhere.
For Heinkel, the battle for the HE-280 continued. As Germany's fortunes began to change, many still clung to the belief in a rapid victory, even in the second half of 1942. Erhard Milch was one of them. After Udet's suicide, he did manage to increase aircraft production, but at a cost. To avoid Hitler's wrath, Milch was unwilling to add any new types to the assembly lines. Doing so would cause monthly production numbers to fall. As a result, most of the pre-war designs remained in production right until the end of the war. Unfortunately for Heinkel and Messerschmitt, Milch's aversion to risk continued to have its effect in the one field where Germany could establish technical superiority: jet planes. In September 1942, both Erhard Milch and the German Air Ministry agreed. Any preparations for series production of the Me-262 would be premature, and in view of Heinkel's numerous commitments, production of the HE-280 was unrealistic as well. It was a curious point of view, but in early 1943, that all changed. In January 1943, Heinkel's HE-280 V6 prototype, powered by two Jumo 004 engines, took flight. For the first time, Heinkel pitched this version as a fighter bomber. In a complete about-face, the German Air Ministry changed its mind and began negotiations for the manufacture of 300 280s. It now seemed as if the 280 would finally see mass production and enter service before the Me-262. Ironically, the 262 V4 prototype, powered by the same Jumo 004 engines as Heinkel's new jet bomber, enjoyed a marked performance advantage over its rival. While the HE-280 was thought to be faster with a better rate of climb and ceiling, it only had 2/3 the range. In the end, the 262 was the superior fighter. In a letter dated March 27, 1943, Milch wrote to Heinkel, ending the 280 project. In Milch's letter, he claimed that the overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. For Heinkel, it was a bitter defeat. In a conference shortly after, Heinkel observed that Milch and his colleagues had a noticeable sense of unease about the jet, and the talk was always about jet bombers. For Willy Messerschmitt, victory over Heinkel would prove a Pyrrhic victory. Meanwhile in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor prototype DG-206 made its first flight. Like the Germans, British officialdom and industry were slow to deliver a reliable jet engine. Official confidence was shaken when the impellers on Whittle's W2B engine continually burst at high speed. This was eventually remedied with imported impellers from General Electric, who in 1941 built their own jet engines based on Whittle's design. Fortunately for the program, Rolls-Royce was called upon to take over development and production of the W2B engine. Back in Germany, development of the Me-262 continued. Compared to the British, the German program was disorganized, inefficient, and veiled in secrecy, even from those who should have known. Surprisingly, Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was kept in the dark. Not until May 22, 1943, did he fly the fourth 262 prototype. Galland was so impressed that he recommended production of the Bf-109 be halted and changed to the new jet fighter. Galland's enthusiasm swept away any remaining hesitancy and vacillation. 72 hours later, Erhard Milch ordered the 262 into series production. But many questions remained. Why did those involved in the program not see the value of the 262 sooner and act before Galland's endorsement? Why was it kept secret from Galland? And why didn't he fly the HE-280? One can only speculate as to what might have been if just 2 years earlier he had flown the 280. Finally, Messerschmitt had what he wanted, but there was one man who didn't agree. Adolf Hitler rejected out of hand any mass production of the Me-262. Said Hitler, "Nothing will be done with the new jet until I have decided on its merits." Unfortunately for Messerschmitt, the Führer was increasingly obsessed with revenge and retribution. Striking back at the enemy was far more important than providing his fighter arm with a fighter capable of defending the Reich. This would lead directly to Germany's third jet-powered aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb. Powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile and the first jet-powered aircraft to see combat in World War II. Shortly after D-Day, the V-1 bombardment of London began. To help counter the threat, the RAF deployed the first jet fighter, the Meteor Mark I. Compared to the HE-280 and the Me-262, the Meteor was slower. But more importantly, it was a combat-ready machine powered by centrifugal jet engines. Though the German axial flow engine offered more punch, Frank Whittle, the genius behind Britain's early jet engines, was sold on the reliability of centrifugal design.
Now, axial flow engines are much more complex than centrifugal, but much more efficient. Ideally, one should have headed for axial flow. But one has to put oneself back a bit in time and remember where we stood in the history of jet development, and that was not very far along the road. Whittle, quite rightly, when I talked to him, he knew all about axial flow, but I said to him, "Why have you gone this way, Frank, into centrifugal?" And he said, "Because in this present state of the art, I am looking for reliability and simplicity."
In November 1943, Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. Hitler scolded those in attendance, asking why, after years of demanding a fast bomber, was he presented with a fighter. Hitler wanted to know if the jet aircraft could carry bombs. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative. For Hitler, the matter was settled. The Me-262 would be produced as a Blitz bomber. In fact, Messerschmitt disobeyed Hitler and continued to develop his jet solely as a fighter. 6 months later, when Hitler found out, he flew into an incandescent rage. On May 25, 1944, he ordered all 262s to be built as bombers. It was a major blow and added more technical problems to an already troubled program. One of the biggest and ongoing hurdles was the development of the Jumo 004 engine into a reliable power plant. The Jumo 004 was an axial flow compressor design. In theory, it offered more power over the higher drag centrifugal compressor engines used by the British. In practice, however, the Jumo engines were considerably inferior. The shortage of strategic materials like chrome and nickel led to the failure of many substandard turbine blades at high temperatures. The Jumo 004 also suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. The Jumo 004 was a technical and operational failure. Not only did the Jumo 004 have a very short lifespan, it was unreliable, prone to surges, stalls, and fires. This was the Me-262's Achilles heel, one Allied pilots would feast on.
The engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, the designers hadn't thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the 262s they picked off were usually in that phase of the operation.
By July 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. While the Me-262 was in production, the numbers in operational service were meager at best, and would remain so until the end of the war. The first American B-17 shot down didn't occur until August 15th. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Shut out since the rejection of the HE-280, Ernst Heinkel was finally brought back into the jet fold. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. For Heinkel, it was a question of pride. Eager to prove himself once more, he accepted the challenge. Heinkel quickly realized that in order for the jet to work, the engine had to be mounted just above the fuselage, similar to the V-1. 12 days after the specification had been issued, the HE-162 mock-up was ready. On September 23, 1944, Heinkel's HE-162 was selected for mass production. Captain Eric Brown recalls demonstrating the HE-162 to Heinkel in a post-war test flight.
He was like a schoolboy jumping up and down with delight, and asked very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. He had heard about the disaster we'd had with it. I found him with a very acute mind and struck me as a highly intelligent person.
By late 1944, the German High Command was fueled by fear, fantasy, and pathological denial. Galland said that the HE-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler youth was beyond reality. Even at this late stage of the war, Heinkel was working on at least 26 different versions. Using slave labor, 100 aircraft were produced in February of 1945. On February 6th, the first group converted to the new type. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. The new jet and rocket fighters introduced late in the war had no impact on the outcome. Many have argued that if the HE-280 had been produced sooner, history would have been different. Perhaps, but in the final analysis, the 280 wouldn't have made a dramatic difference. For Ernst Heinkel, there was a deep bitterness. His early groundbreaking developments were essentially ignored. As to who actually killed the world's first jet fighter, the answer is many. The HE-280 was quite simply a victim of mismanagement and industrial chaos. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Göring, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Instead of a uniform, consistent policy towards aircraft production, confusion and chaos reigned.
Göring must hugely accept blame for a lot of the failings of the Luftwaffe, particularly the delay and the mismanaging getting aircraft into production. And to a large extent, Udet was one of his causes of his problem. Udet was an extroverted, magnificent exhibition pilot in civil life, and he had been in Göring's squadron in World War I. Ernst Udet had no interest in politics, and Göring approached him as an old squadron mate and said, you know, the Nazi party needs you and your experience. Come in and be the head of our technical department. Udet was talked into this and was completely out of his depth.
Firms like Heinkel and Messerschmitt tried to build everything from trainers to strategic bombers, every effort made by the Air Ministry to move them towards any specialization was effectively countered. Clear-cut technical objectives were never issued. Programs were allowed to continue regardless of the enormous waste in time, skill, and materials. Overall, the Nazi management of the aircraft industry was uncoordinated, inefficient, plagued by ignorance and incompetence. Even if the HE-280 had become operational in 1942, its overall effectiveness would have been limited. It all came down to the Jumo 004 power plant. Unreliable with a critically short lifespan, it was not ready for combat operations. Serviceability rates would have been low, as was the case with the ME-262. Finding good pilots would have been another issue. The number of newly trained pilots could barely keep pace with attrition. Fuel shortages also began to take hold. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was a dying force with no chance of recovery. As the world's first jet fighter, Heinkel's HE-280 was a marvel of technology and inspiration. Unfortunately for Heinkel, those in power saw little use for his twin-jet fighter. Hitler's reluctance to produce jets almost certainly doomed what little hope Germany had of ever producing an effective jet fighter force. As the Allies sifted through the spoils of their victory, the incredible technology left behind, they counted themselves lucky that Germany had recognized the potential of jet power too late.
The jets were left absolutely untouched. Now, I was puzzled about this, frankly. What had motivated this? It certainly wasn't because it was overrun too quickly for them to have got rid of these jet aircraft. I think, deep down, it was a sense of pride of what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted us to see it.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. for more amazing aerial footage. And to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.